Okay, so let's talk about competitive advantage, or as many value investors will say, let's talk about how to determine a company's moat. This is a vital part of being a great investor because what you're doing is trying to understand how a company's assets might fail to continue generating free cash flow into the future. So let me use an example to demonstrate how important this idea is. Let's say that we have two businesses. The first business is an ice cream stand that will sell generic vanilla ice cream and a few other unique flavors. With that said, the business is making a ton of free cash flow, and you're curious if it can continue to do the same into the future. The second business is a music store that rents out and sells musical instruments to the local community. This business is also making a ton of money, and you're curious if it can continue. So when a person thinks through the competitive advantages of both of these businesses, they might quickly conclude that they have very little moat or advantage over competitors coming into the marketplace. This is a common trait that many people share because they're very quick to make hypotheses about why something is good or bad. Now, if we're going to conduct more research about the two types of businesses that I provide examples for, what we're going to do is we're going to uncover a little bit more facts about each of these businesses so that you can kind of understand how that company's ability to sustain those future cash flows into the future might look. So let's take a quick look at this innocent ice cream stand. At first glance, it might seem to be a cash cow with no competitor. And you might conclude, well, that would be really easy to interrupt. But now let me describe to you this ice cream stand. When you dig into the reasons of why it's done so well, something really interesting happens. You discover that the business is located on the busiest street in the whole county. Not only that, but the owner also owns the 20 miles of land on both directions of the road, and competition can't open a store within miles of the business. The company has a really appealing brand that touts to the customer that all the ice cream is made from dairy cows that roam on the fields behind the business. In fact, the name of the business is Fresh Farm Ice Cream. All the ice cream is made in front of large windows where customers can see employees mixing the milk. Not only that, but the business is located in southern Florida, where it's warm year-round. This business has been around for 35 years and has a cult-like following. Sounds like a gem, right? So now let's talk about the second business that I'm going to describe here. It's a music store, and it has a major concern. Recently, it was announced that Amazon has gotten into the music rental business. Amazon is heavily promoting the service to local middle schools by providing a $1,000 grant to the schools for every 5 new students that sign up for the service. Although this scenario that I'm describing is totally false, this is not real. I'm sure we could probably imagine Amazon trying to do something like this. Additionally, the local music store that we're talking about here has prices that sell at a premium. They're more expensive than the online dealer because they need to pay for their employees and inventory levels and all that sort of stuff that all brick and mortar businesses struggle to compete with online businesses on. On one afternoon, you visit the store and you observe the customers. Once inside, you see numerous people perusing the store. They seem to be looking at the various instruments and then pulling out their smartphones to compare prices at other locations. After a few minutes, the potential customers leave empty-handed. When looking at the store's free cash flow, you notice that although the free cash flow is really good and it's making a lot of money, the trend is going down, and it's going down significantly from where it was 5 years ago. So the reason I provided these two stories is because I wanted you to see how important it is to know more about the business before making any conclusions about competitive advantage. Sometimes simple businesses like ice cream stands can have an enormous moat around the business, even though it might be like a commodity type business that you would think would be very easy to penetrate. In the example provided, there were a few things that made the moat strong with the ice cream business. The first one was a very busy road with lots of traffic. The second thing was the land advantage, where a competitor couldn't open a store close by. The third thing, a really catchy brand that's very niche and has staying power. The fourth thing, a unique storefront that the customers could watch them making the ice cream. That's really unique and something that would make this store stand out and keep people coming back. The last thing is a psychological impact of being in business for such a long time and a pattern of life that supports repeat customers. It's part of these people's habits to go back to this place and then to tell their friends whenever they're in town. All of these things are super valuable. And here's the point that's really important. You won't find any of those things on a balance sheet. You won't find that on the ice cream store's balance sheet. It doesn't say that stuff. Instead, you'd need to visit the store to understand this very, very valuable attributes that can't necessarily be seen in numbers. So when we look at a large company like Apple, they have very similar attributes, but they're much more difficult to describe than this small local business. So as a result of this difficulty and sheer volume of attributes that a person needs to look at and try to understand when making an assessment of a company's competitive advantage, we've designed a checklist that can help you go through this. And underneath this video or on this page that you're at, you can see where you can download this checklist for making an assessment of competitive advantage. Not only should you list the competitive advantages of the business that you're wanting to invest in, but you should also understand the competitive advantages of the company's competitor. So you need to go in there. If you're looking at Apple, you should probably look at Google or some other Samsung or some other smartphone maker and understand what their competitive advantages are. But this is the part that's probably the most important piece of all of this. In the next segment, what you're going to learn about are ways to draw models for future expectations of free cash flows. When you conduct those assessments of the competitive advantage research that you're doing from this checklist, what you're really going to be doing is you're using that to understand whether that free cash flow of all those assets within the company are going to be able to be sustained moving into the future. So in the examples that I provided to kind of give you the story and how to think through this with like the ice cream stand, that's really kind of a single level asset. When you get into these large macro companies like Apple or Google, these companies have numerous levels of assets. Like Google AdWords is just one asset inside of Google. YouTube would be another asset inside of Google. You got all these different assets. And so what you have to do is you have to ask yourself, is there going to be a competitor to YouTube that's going to take some of their market share? Is there going to be a competitor to Google AdWords that's going to take some of their market share? And how are they going to do that? So what I would tell you is when you ask yourself that question, you try to understand what's that competitive advantage, what's driving that market behavior that so many people are using those two assets that I just named with Google. How could that be impaired? How could that decrease the future cash flows into the future? If you can't come up with something, well, that's good. Then you could say that if they're making $100 million off of that one asset this year, then I expect it to be $100 million moving forward. Or, however you would adjust that. But you need to think in those kind of terms as you'd go through a company's core level assets. And that's what I would tell you to do is pull out a piece of paper. For Google, you'd list all their core level assets, that would be a very long list. But that's what you need to do if you're going to invest in these companies and actually make assessments as to what you think the free cash flows are going to look like into the future. And then under each one of those assets, you need to understand it from this context of all these different things that we have listed on our checklist and make those assessments. And then if you think that there's not a good competitive advantage holding that in place, well, then you can kind of impair those cash flows moving forward. And then you're going to have a much better representation of what those future cash flows might look like moving forward. So that's how you can kind of use the information that you're gaining from the checklist and what you just learned in this segment and apply it to what you're about to learn in the very next segment. So I hope you guys enjoyed it.